Welcome to Counterpoint. I'm Tanya Granick-Allen. So it's been a very exciting, dramatic, I'm not sure what the word is, time here in Canada. The trucker convoys continue to protest, at some points blockade, especially at the Ambassador Bridge recently. Again, we have sometimes over 1 million people in Ottawa protesting, especially on the weekends. The honking seems to have swelled now that there's a court order to stop that. But there is still a lot of activity on the front, and most of it is centered around Ottawa. But what is going on within the convoy itself? What are they really after? Are they looking for that meeting with Prime Minister Trudeau? As of the time of taping, that meeting has yet to take place. Are their demands being heard? Are their concerns being heard? Within the convoy, there aren't just truckers and they're not just citizens who come on the weekends. There are actually families with children. Well, later on in the program, we're going to discuss some of the issues surrounding democracy and what we've seen going on with the convoys. But top of mind for me now is I want to talk about what's going on with the children and some concerns about the safety and welfare of children. And joining me is Jared Teitel, a lawyer with Norman and Chris. Jared, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Tanya. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, just to get this straight out, from my observation as someone watching the news, it seems like a very happy, generally peaceful protest. So I don't, on the onset, have any concerns about child welfare or concerns of the children traveling with their parents to protest. You know, I've attended protests. I've brought my children. They're usually okay. But I've seen headlines recently in the media of concerns, and the Children's Aid Services is concerned about the safety and well-being of the children. What are these concerns, and is there merit?
Well, the first point to say is the mandate of the Children's Aid Society or the Child Protection Organization, they're obliged to act and place the child in protection, not necessarily if the child's in direct harm, but if there's a risk of harm to the child. So it's based on that test of risk as to why we're seeing the organizations come up in the headlines right now.
Okay. And I suppose, so would, for example, a child sleeping in the sleeper cabin in a truck, in the front cab of a truck, would that be considered putting a child at risk? Why isn't this child in a bed? Why are they sleeping in the bed within a truck?
Well, it comes down to how that risk is defined. So again, the risk of some potential theoretical harm, that's not enough. It has to be an actual risk that's likely and real. It can't be speculative. So to that point, it comes down to where are these kids in these situations? If this is a case of, as you mentioned earlier, of parents involving their children in a protest that they view as safe, that's one thing. But if the situation started to escalate, we're hearing child protection organizations working with the police might move in. There's reports about exposure to carbon monoxide and diesel. Those are alarm bells for a children's aid organization.
Okay, so if there was a call or there were concerns in specific cases where Children's Aid Services felt that children might be at risk, what would be the next steps? What could happen after that?
Well, the Children's Aid Society has an obligation to investigate any reports that come in, whether they're anonymous, whether they're from the police, they must go in and take steps. But a mandate of the Children's Aid step, they're obliged to act in the least intrusive way possible. And that's one of their mandates before they take any steps. It has to be the least intrusive measure possible. And that reflects the value that our society gives parents a lot of personal autonomy to raise their children how they see fit and to make decisions for their own children's personal safety. But that's sort of where that's how it would start. And then the next step would be the CAS worker, based on those interactions, would do an assessment of risk. And that's where it really comes down to the parents. Because if this is a situation, as you say, where the parent is receptive to the Children's Aid Society, is willing to meet with them, explain the concerns, show them the plan of care they have set up about, if they are staying overnight at the protest, here's where my child's sleeping, here's my child's going to the bathroom, here are the other ways I've met with my child's needs. And if the parents specifically say, if the situation escalates and there's a specific mandate for our kids that aren't safe, we'll take action. It's kind of hard pressed to see a society worker escalating from there. Conversely, if it's a pattern of negligence and there's a real risk of harm, that's where the CAS might become more involved.
If there are parents who are bringing their children to these protests, what steps, or if there are children, with their parents who may be truckers in this convoy, what steps should they take to not get ensnared, if you will, with the Children's Aid Services? Again, 30 seconds.
30 seconds. Number one point, the Children's Aid Society, they're not a political organization. They're not taking a position in all this. Their prerogative is the best interest of children. That's all they care about. So to answer your question, parents need to be receptive to the Children's Aid Society.
Welcome back. We're going to discuss a little bit more of the legal angles of protests specific to the trucker convoy, but also in general. And joining me now to have that discussion is Jay Cameron, Litigation Director with the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms. Jay, thank you so much for joining me. So I think top of mind, most Canadians want to know, is this trucker convoy, is this protest in Ottawa legal?
Thanks for having me on, Tanya. So Section 2B and Section 2C of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms protects the right to speak, hear, and participate in the democratic process by assembling. And so Canadians have a right that is constitutionally protected to gather and to protest. And it's important to note that there is no time limit on the right to peaceful protest. In the application of this case, the truckers came from across the country in winter and traveled thousands of miles. And you've heard some political commentary say, well, now it's time to go home, turn around, go back, your point is made, right? You've been here long enough. But the fact of the matter is that that's not how 2C works. And so as long as they are peaceful in Ottawa, there's a right to be there. And there's been various attempts to recast it as some sort of criminal activity. But, I think events on the ground do a lot to counter that narrative. People playing street hockey, kids on bouncy houses. It's a different kind of.
There have been some unsavory characters, around the protest. I don't know if they're officially affiliated or what. We've seen a few things here and there. On the whole, I think I agree with you. It's been very peaceful, very happy, but there have been some unsavory characters. So at what point is it determined that, this is no longer a peaceful protest? Maybe we should look to the Ambassador Bridge protest as an example.
Right. So if there is any illegal activity by some actors, that does not nullify the right of other people to peacefully protest. That's what the case law says. So that's an important point because, yes, if there's been some unsavory characters, whether they were planted there or whether they were acting out on their own, really, it's immaterial. The fact is that the right to protest is an individual right. Now, blockading a bridge is a different issue because you're blockading and preventing the flow of goods and services. And I saw tweets from some politicians even this morning saying in Ottawa, it took them an extra minute to go from the suburbs to the Parliament building, which means that there's not a whole lot of interference with the ability of people to move around the city. And so that's an important point. But the bridge blockade is a different story.
So it was the bridge blockade at the Ambassador Bridge at the Detroit-Windsor border. Would that be considered an illegal blockade? Is that no longer considered a protest then?
Yeah, if the Justice Center's position is that if you're completely blockading the flow of goods and services and a border entry, that's on pretty precarious legal footing. Can I say it that way?
Yeah, I think we get what you mean there. I appreciate what you're saying. So we have seen calls from the left, from the right, whoever these left and right are, saying end the blockade, stop it, or end the protest. You've made your point. You've said it yourself, or you've mentioned that you've heard this said. That you've made your point. Now go home. To me, I understand from what I understand from the truckers is they're looking to see actual results. This could drag on for who knows how long. I mean, we are hearing that Justin Trudeau might introduce some measures. We'll see how effective they are or what he plans to do. If this goes on for months and months and months, is there anything legally the government can do to stop it?
I just want to make a couple of points about that, if I may. When you come from across the country and take 3 weeks to do so, including travel, you're coming because you're hurting or you're commiserating with somebody else who is hurting. And the truckers have a legitimate grievance. There have been dramatic infringements of civil liberties in Canada under protected by the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And so they have a legitimate grievance. And the fact is that the political elite have been too arrogant to come out and speak to them. And that has only convinced the truckers that they need to stay there longer to be heard. And so one of the ways to diffuse this would be to talk to people. That's what we do in Canada. That's what we do as a civilized country. And because there's a right to protest, which is the analogous right to the U.S. under the U.S. Bill of Rights under the First Amendment, there needs to be some dialogue.
Right. And I think that's been missing. We have not seen dialogue. We've seen other groups who protest receive that dialogue, but we have not seen that from our political class. And it's really a shame, because I do think these truckers would like to go home. They, as you said, they come from thousands of kilometers away. We have 10 seconds left. Is there any final word you'd like to leave us with?
No, I just think it's important to protect civil liberties in a free society.
Jay Cameron, thank you so much. I appreciate your time.
Thanks, Tanya.
Welcome back. And now joining us to help us unpack some of the underlying issues as it relates to democracy and I guess the thirst for freedom for many of these truckers is Dr. Julie Ponesse, pandemic ethics scholar with the Democracy Fund. Dr. Ponesse, it's been a few months since we've had you on, and I remember it was fresh on the heels of, I guess, your termination at Western University, and now you're back in the media spotlight, navigating, I guess, the way through the COVID crisis. And now here we are, there's a convoy for freedom. What would you make of this protest? Does it carry a lot of weight?
Well, I think it's fascinating. You know, I was in Ottawa 2 weekends ago now, I guess, the first weekend. So I was there the Sunday after they arrived. And one of the reasons I went then is because I thought, I mean, if you think about human nature and human psychology and our ability to stick with a task and keep our attention and things like that, I would never have guessed that it would have lasted as long as it has. And I think the fact that it has, and the fact that the protesters have, despite what we're seeing in the mainstream media, have had a very peaceful, resolute, committed, in my view, very democratic statement for this long, I think is just really incredible. And I've been thinking about, this question: what is a person to do when we believe that the world we inhabit is unjust? What are the options? What if you've written all the letters, you've called your MP, your MPP, you've commented, you've written to letters to the editor at various newspapers, and there's nothing, and there's silence. And it isn't even the case that there's sort of an acknowledgement and an attempt to engage. What do you do when you're in that position? And I think the truckers got to that position. I gave a speech back in November for the Democracy Fund, and I quoted this article. It's an academic article that basically suggests that you need a noisy 10% in order to get traction for an idea to spread throughout the population. And I think that this trucker protest is a sign that we reached that threshold. The idea spread, it got enough traction. I think people felt that there was enough support. And there has been. People have been going and circling into and out of Ottawa since they arrived there with incredible support. And they're taking them food and clothing for their children and gasoline for the trucks and all kinds of things,
And I think it's been surprising. I'm a child of immigrants in this country, and I know my parents always said, well, Canada's very calm, peaceful, easily satisfied. There's not really any upheaval here, and for Canada to now be this focal point for the world, it's shocking to me. And in some ways, I'm so happy because, I love Canada, and I want us to embrace our identity, and that is freedom and democracy. So to see Canadians kind of come together, and in this way, and in this case, it's a fight for the truckers, a fight for freedom. But it's still the way you look at it. I love it when people protest, whatever cause, even if it's a cause I don't believe in. They're exercising their freedom and their democracy, and I love to see that. So I don't know. It brings joy to my heart to know that people are exercising their democratic rights.
Well, it's interesting you say that, if your parents were saying that Canada is kind of this calm, peaceful place. Well, yes. And I'm someone who was, born here, and I never thought we would see something like this, that we would need to see something like this. But sometimes I think we trade off peace for complacency. and that we gradually give away too much for the sake of holding on to that politeness and that sort of tolerance between people, because tolerance can hide a lot that's going on, that's bubbling under the surface, right? And I think we're seeing now that a group of Canadians who, generally speaking, have been very, fit that mold, who have been very, very calm, polite, kind to one another, just want to get along, are saying, this is a step too far, government. It's too much. And fellow citizens, you're asking too much of us. And as you probably know and have seen, this is really not about vaccination for the truckers. This is about mandating, right? Their concerns are about what happens in a country, what happens to a country, to its citizens, when you start mandating medical procedures that are supposed to be about informed consent. And, coincidentally, I was just reading through some news stories this morning, and there was I think because of the protest situation, and there was an article about, the history of nonviolent protests in the past. And of course, it discussed Martin Luther King. And he said, I think it's something like this: the strong man is the man who will not hit back, who can stand up for his rights and not hit back. And I think,
Julie, I'm going to pause you there. I want you to analyze that quote. We've got to cut to a commercial, but we'll pick that up right in a moment. Welcome back. We're continuing our conversation with Dr. Julie Ponesse, pandemics ethics scholar with the Democracy Fund. Julie, just before the commercial break, you were sharing a quote, and please continue on.
Yeah, it's a quote by Martin Luther King, and he said that it's the strong man is the man who will not hit back, who can stand up for his rights and yet not hit back. And I think that's what takes true resolve. In some sense, it's easy to engage in action, and it's very easy to react, right? It would be very easy, I think, in this situation where citizens have, for a couple of years now, increasingly felt the encroachment of government into their personal lives, into the rights they have to protect their families and raise their children as they see fit. But it takes, I think, an incredible amount of courage to not react when you're provoked. And there's some really interesting questions, I think, about, what are the limits of civil disobedience? And what does it mean to respect justice while you are being civilly disobedient? Not all acts of civil disobedience in a democracy are unjust, in my belief. And that's what we're seeing. That's the messaging we're getting from our federal government, and I think our Ontario provincial government, which is that the mere act of resisting a government order is unjust civil disobedience.
And protests aren't foreign to Canada. We had many, actually, just before we entered COVID. There was the rail blockades during the first, COVID wave, the first lockdowns. We had the BLM protests. And one thing and one image that remains in my mind, and I'll put up on the camera here, is when Justin Trudeau met with the protesters and actually joined in on the protest, which I found kind of interesting, because it was a protest against government and police, and then the Prime Minister himself joined in. So it was complicated to understand that. To my knowledge, Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister, has not met with the protesters yet.
And has said he will not.
What does that mean for democracy when we have, 1 million plus Canadians at the foot of Parliament, at the seat of democracy in this country, and, the one holding the lever of power will not meet?
I think it means a lot. And I think I think regardless of what side of this issue you're on, regardless of what you think about the government's COVID response, this should be a sign. The fact that there are events going on at the base of Parliament Hill most of the day, every day now for the last 2+ weeks. And while that's happening, MPs are meeting in the House and having these higher level removed discussions about democracy in Canada. I mean, in some sense, nothing could be more obtuse or more undemocratic than that. I gave a speech that was part of the convoy events 2 Mondays ago now, I guess 2 weeks ago exactly. And halfway through the speech, it was so cold, the audio cut out. And so we had to do something. The crowd started chanting, "Meet with us, meet with us." That's what they're asking. right? The truckers who are Canadian citizens, the people who are there, a very diverse crowd. There are Blacks, whites, East Asians, young, old, Indigenous people. They're asking for the federal government to meet with them politically, but they're also asking for the federal government to produce their top medical and scientific experts to explain and try to justify these mandates. And they haven't shown up.
Right. And again, it's I think it's a negative on Canada's democracy, and it's somewhat embarrassing because I've seen international media reports reporting on the fact that the protest will continue, and the Prime Minister has yet to meet with them. And I think, again, Canada being a very decent, a very calm, a very peace-loving country, that extending that olive branch or just sitting and having that dialogue, that is a basic form of decency. So I would like to see that happen. It's my prayer that will happen. We will see. We only have 45 seconds left. How long will the truckers stay? How long will they last? When do people get worn out on either side? 40 seconds.
I mean, only they can know that, and they might not even know that. I think they have withstood a lot more physically and psychologically and morally than anyone would have expected them to. But I can say that in speaking with a lot of them, they are very resolute. But I think we are in a major political crisis in Canada, Tanya. And if the mandates lift, that's not the end of this. We have a lot of repair to do. We need to do a lot of thinking and understanding about our constitution, our democracy, our country moving forward, so that we make sure that something like this doesn't happen again.
Dr. Julie, it was great to see you, and that's a wrap for Counterpoint today.